Somewhere beneath the red rock of the Grand Canyon, in a place no map will show you, there is said to be a door. Not a door of wood or steel, but a crack in the stone, hidden behind a waterfall or buried under 1,000 tons of rubble, that leads down into a world most of us were never supposed to know about. The people who lived beside this canyon for thousands of years, the Hopi, did not think of it as empty space carved by a river. They thought of it as a mouth. A mouth that once opened, and let their ancestors climb out of the darkness and into the light of this world. And if something can climb out, the old stories whisper, then something can still be down there, waiting in the dark beneath your feet right now. Somewhere in this story, there is a real newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, still sitting in old archive drawers in Arizona, that thousands of researchers have pored over for more than a century, hunting for one more clue hidden between its lines. There is a real sacred site, still visited today, still spoken of in hushed, careful terms by the people whose ancestors are said to have first climbed up out of it. There is a real canyon, so enormous that if you tried to hike every single trail inside it, marked and unmarked, it would take you years, and even then you would not have seen all of it. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is not just a legend. It is a legend tangled up with a real newspaper article, a real expedition, a real government agency that says none of it ever happened, and a real canyon so vast and so unexplored that even today, entire sections of it have never felt a human boot. By the end of this, you will not know exactly what to believe. By the time this story is over, you will have walked through a creation myth older than most nations on Earth, a newspaper hoax that fooled a generation, a sacred prophecy carved into stone, and a canyon so vast that even now, no one alive can say with total certainty what is or is not hidden inside it. And that, more than anything else, is the whole point of this story, because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried, generation after generation, the way the Hopi have carried this one, for longer than anyone can say. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the rumor, but the beginning of the canyon itself, and the people who called it home before anyone else even knew it existed. Picture the high desert of northern Arizona. The sun is merciless here, the air is thin and dry, and the land stretches out in every direction in shades of rust and gold. If you walked to the edge of it without warning, the ground would simply vanish in front of you. One step, solid earth. The next step, a drop of over a mile, straight down into a gorge so wide that the far wall looks like a different country. This is the Grand Canyon, 277 miles long. Up to 18 miles wide, in places more than 6,000 feet deep. It is not just a hole in the ground. It is a wound in time itself, cut open by the Colorado River over millions of years, layer by layer exposing rock that formed before there was any life on this planet at all. Stand at the bottom, at the very base of it, and you are looking at stone nearly 2 billion years old. Older than bones, older than trees, older than almost anything you could put a name to. For the people who lived around its rim, this was never just scenery. It was sacred ground, and it was also, in a very real sense, the birthplace of the world. The Hopi are one of the oldest continuously inhabited nations in North America. Their villages, perched on high desert mesas not far from the canyon, have been lived in for over 1,000 years without interruption. That alone should stop you for a second. While empires in Europe rose and crumbled, while entire cities were built and burned and rebuilt, the same families, the same clans, kept living in the same stone villages on the same mesas, telling the same stories to their children, generation after generation, almost without a break. And one of the stories they told, the oldest and most sacred of them all, is about where human beings came from. And it does not start on the surface of the earth, it starts underneath it. According to Hopi tradition, this world we live in now is not the first world, it is the fourth. Before this one there were 3 other worlds, and human beings lived in each of them, deep underground in darkness, learning how to be good, how to live with respect for each other and for the earth and for the animals around them. But in each of those earlier worlds, people eventually forgot. They grew greedy, they grew cruel, they stopped listening to the ones who tried to guide them. And each time that happened, the world they were living in became corrupted, unlivable, doomed. And each time, a small number of people who had not forgotten, who had stayed humble and faithful, were led upward through a narrow opening into the next world above. The final passage, the one that brought humanity up into this world, the world we are standing in right now, is said to have happened through a hole, an opening in the earth. The Hopi call it the Sipapu. And according to many keepers of this tradition, the location of that opening, the very gateway through which humanity first emerged into the light of this fourth world, sits inside the Grand Canyon, near the place where the little Colorado River joins the main river, in a travertine dome that still exists today, a strange, hollow, bulging mound of orange mineral rock rising up out of the canyon floor like a blister on the skin of the earth. It is real. You can find it on modern topographic maps. It is treated as one of the most sacred sites in the entire Hopi worldview. Traditional Hopi men have made pilgrimages there for generations, walking for days across brutal desert terrain, to visit this one small, strange opening in the ground, because as far as their tradition is concerned, that hole is the birth canal of the human race in this world. Every one of us in that telling came up through the earth right there, into the sunlight, blinking, newborn, standing at the bottom of the Grand Canyon for the very first time. Now hold on to that image for a moment, a doorway between worlds, sitting at the bottom of the deepest canyon on the continent, because the Hopi did not only tell a story about coming up out of the underworld once, long ago, and being done with it forever, they also told stories about what happened along the way, stories about the underworld itself, stories about the beings who lived there. And one of those stories, more than any other, is the one that people cannot stop whispering about today. It is the story of the ant people. In Hopi tradition, the ant people, sometimes called Anu Sinam, are not simply insects. They are spirit beings, small in stature, industrious, disciplined, and deeply connected to the underworld itself. And according to the old stories, during the terrible destruction that ended earlier worlds, when fire rained down from above or when the earth itself split open and burned, it was the ant people who saved humanity. They opened tunnels beneath the surface. They led the faithful down into hidden chambers, deep below the destruction, and they kept them alive there, fed and sheltered, teaching them how to store food for hard times, how to be patient, how to work together, until it was finally safe to come back up to the surface and start again. Think about what that means. A hidden network of chambers under the earth, entered through concealed openings, built to shelter human beings through a catastrophe, stocked with supplies to keep them alive for a long, long time. That is not just a myth about insects. That is, almost word for word, a description of a bunker. An ancient, sacred, spiritual description of an underground refuge, passed down for who knows how many centuries, long before anyone had ever heard the words fallout shelter or bug-out location. And the Hopi will tell you exactly where the doorway is said to be, not in some vague, unspecified underworld, in the Grand Canyon itself. Now, if this story had stayed only inside Hopi oral tradition, respected quietly by the people who kept it, it would already be remarkable enough. A creation story is not something outsiders get to dismiss as silly or primitive just because it does not match a geology textbook. It carries the memory, the values, and the identity of an entire nation. But this story did not stay contained. In the year 1909, it collided head-on with the modern world, in the pages of a newspaper, and what happened next is the reason you are watching this video today. On the 5th of April, 1909, a newspaper called the Phoenix Gazette ran a front-page story that would go on to haunt conspiracy circles, canyon explorers, and amateur historians for well over 100 years. The headline alone was enough to stop readers cold. It announced the discovery of an underground citadel deep within the walls of the Grand Canyon, not a small cave, not a scattering of pottery shards, a citadel, an underground city carved into the rock, filled with the remnants of what the article claimed was a lost civilization. According to the story, a government-funded expedition, organized under the Smithsonian Institution, and led by a man named Professor S.A. Jordan, had spent months conducting a survey deep in a remote section of the canyon, roughly out from a spot the article called Trinity Alcove, along the Colorado River. The explorer credited with the actual discovery was a man named G.E. Kincaid, who the article said had spent 30 years navigating the Colorado, and who had already made a name for himself boating solo down its dangerous rapids. The story went that Kincaid, while exploring the cliffs, noticed strange, regular discoloration on the rock face, high above the water line. Curious, he found a narrow ledge that let him climb up to investigate. What he found, according to the account, was an opening, a tunnel mouth. And when he finally forced his way inside, he claimed to have discovered a vast network of man-made passages and rooms cut directly into the stone, extending for what the article estimated at hundreds of feet, possibly much further, into the heart of the canyon wall. Inside, the story claimed, were the signs of an advanced and ancient people, rooms carved with geometric precision, hallways wide enough for many people to pass through side by side, storage chambers filled with what looked like preserved food supplies, though petrified and unrecognizable after untold centuries underground, tools made of copper, fragments of pottery unlike anything found anywhere else on the continent. And strangest of all, according to the article, mummified human remains, wrapped and sealed, positioned deliberately, along with statues and carvings bearing an unmistakable resemblance to imagery from ancient Egypt and ancient Tibet. Read that again slowly and imagine reading it for the first time in 1909 in your local newspaper over your morning coffee. A hidden underground city in the middle of the American desert. Egyptian-style artifacts, Tibetan-style artifacts, preserved bodies, copper tools, all of it sealed away for who knows how long, inside a canyon that millions of tourists were already visiting every single year, and yet somehow none of them had ever noticed the entrance. The article claimed that Professor Jordan believed the underground city had been built by a migratory population from Asia, possibly connected to ancient Egyptian civilization, who had crossed the Pacific thousands of years earlier and settled here, in the American Southwest, long before recorded history began. It claimed that thousands of relics had already been catalogued. It claimed the Smithsonian Institution itself was funding continued excavation, but was keeping the location strictly secret, worried about looters, or worried about the sheer scale of what they might be sitting on top of. And then, just as suddenly as the story appeared, it disappeared. No follow-up article was ever published. No official Smithsonian record of the expedition, of Professor S.A. Jordan, or of G.E. Kincaid has ever been found. When later researchers, decades afterward, formally asked the Smithsonian Institution whether any of this had ever happened, the answer that came back was blunt and unambiguous. No such expedition took place. No such artifacts exist in any collection. No employee named S.A. Jordan has ever been on staff. As far as the Smithsonian is concerned, the entire story is fiction. Almost certainly one of the many sensationalized, entirely fabricated tales that newspapers of that era printed to sell copies, in an age before fact-checking, before photographs could easily accompany every claim, when a good story sold just as well as a true one, sometimes better. And most historians, if you ask them plainly, will agree with the Smithsonian. They will point out that 1909 newspapers were notorious for running elaborate hoaxes. They will point out that no photographs from the expedition have ever surfaced. They will point out that the geology of the described location doesn't obviously support caverns and tunnels of that scale. They will tell you, quite reasonably, that this reads like exactly what it probably is. A tall tale, dressed up with just enough real geography and just enough scientific language to feel plausible to a reader in 1909, and that it has simply refused to die because it is, frankly, an incredible story. But here is where things get strange. Here is the part that keeps this story alive, generation after generation, long after any rational person should have let it go. The Hopi were already telling this story before the newspaper ever existed. Long before G.E. Kincaid supposedly climbed up a canyon wall and found a tunnel, the Hopi were describing an underground refuge, hidden inside the canyon, built to shelter people through catastrophe, entered through a concealed opening, connected to ancient beings who lived below the surface. The newspaper article describes copper tools, and there is a long tradition, contested but persistent, of ancient copper mining and trade networks across parts of North America, far older and more sophisticated than most people realize. The newspaper article describes Egyptian and Tibetan-style imagery, and skeptics will rightly tell you that plenty of unrelated ancient cultures around the world independently developed similar visual styles, spirals, sun symbols, stepped pyramids, simply because those are natural shapes for humans to create. But if you are someone who has spent years listening to the elders, someone who already grew up hearing about the ant people and their hidden tunnels, and then you read a 100-year-old newspaper article describing almost exactly that, in almost exactly the right place, it is very hard not to feel a chill run down your spine. Which story came first, really? Did a newspaper reporter in 1909 somehow hear fragments of Hopi oral tradition, second-hand, filtered through settlers and traders and missionaries, and weave it into an exciting piece of fiction to sell papers? That is the most likely explanation, and it is worth sitting with because it is probably the true one. Stories travel. Details get borrowed, exaggerated, repackaged. A newspaperman looking for a sensational headline would have had every reason to reach for the most dramatic local legend he could find and dress it up as fact. Or is there something else going on? Something the Hopi have known for far longer than any of us? Something that a wandering river explorer, whether his name was really Kincaid or not, might have genuinely stumbled across, in a canyon so enormous, so folded, so riddled with side canyons and hidden alcoves that entire sections of it remain essentially unexplored even with modern satellite mapping. Because here is a fact that even the skeptics have to admit. The Grand Canyon really is that vast. It really does contain thousands of caves. The National Park Service itself has documented well over 1,000 caves within canyon boundaries, and by their own admission, fewer than 5% of them have ever been thoroughly explored, mapped, or surveyed. Most are inaccessible, hidden behind sheer rock faces hundreds of feet above the nearest trail, reachable only by climbing gear or by helicopter, in terrain so dangerous that even trained park rangers approach it with extreme caution. One of the only caves open to the public, Cave of the Domes on Horseshoe Mesa, gives visitors just a small glimpse of what lies beneath the surface, and even that modest cave took explorers years to fully map. So when someone tells you with total confidence that the story of an underground city beneath the Grand Canyon is completely, absolutely impossible, you are entitled to ask them a simple question. How would we know? who has actually been down there to check? The answer, uncomfortably, is almost nobody, and the National Park Service, for its part, has never been especially eager to encourage that kind of exploration. Large sections of the canyon, including many known cave systems, are closed to the public entirely, officially to protect fragile ecosystems, sensitive archaeological sites, and dangerous bat colonies that carry disease. That is almost certainly the real, boring, bureaucratic reason. But if you are the kind of person who already has a taste for mystery, that explanation will never feel quite satisfying enough. Closed off, restricted, protected. Every one of those words can mean exactly what it says, and every one of those words can also, if you squint, sound like exactly what someone would say if they wanted to keep people away from something they did not want found. Let's step back into the story itself, though, because there is more to it than just one newspaper article from 1909. The legend has grown arms and legs over the decades, picked up new details, absorbed new witnesses, and wrapped itself even tighter around the Hopi tradition that inspired it in the first place. There are stories passed down among certain Hopi families of elders who spoke of a time long ago when their ancestors were led underground not once at the dawn of this world, but more than once during times of terrible danger. Floods that swallowed villages whole, fires that swept across the land with no warning, and each time, it is said, the same guidance came. Go down, go under the earth, wait until it is safe. The ant people will show you the way, and the ant people will keep you fed, if you are humble enough to accept their help and disciplined enough to follow their example. Storing what you have, working steadily, never wasting, never taking more than you need. There is something almost eerily practical about that story when you actually sit with it. It is not simply supernatural for its own sake. It reads in some ways like ancient survival wisdom, wrapped in sacred language so that it would never be forgotten. Build shelter before the disaster comes. Store food before you need it. Learn discipline before your life depends on it. And remember always that the earth itself has places that can save you, if you know where to look, and if you have earned the right to be shown. Now bring the newspaper story back into the frame. An expedition, a hidden tunnel, rooms cut into rock, preserved food. This is where the legend truly locks together in people's minds. Hopi tradition and 1909 sensational journalism fitting into each other like two halves of the same secret, whether or not that was ever the intention. And once people saw that fit, they could not unsee it. Amateur historians began combing through the Phoenix Gazette article line by line, trying to match its vague geographic clues. A spot roughly 45 miles up the river from a place called Ryan, near a formation called Marble Canyon, against real maps of the region. Some believed they had narrowed it down to a specific stretch of cliffs. Others insisted the location described in the article does not physically match anywhere in the actual canyon, and never did, which they take as further proof the whole thing was invented by someone who had never actually been there. And then there are the disappearances. No conspiracy legend is complete without them, and this one has its share, even if most can be explained by the simple, brutal fact that the Grand Canyon has swallowed careless travelers for over a century, regardless of any hidden cities. Hikers who wander off marked trails looking for caves and never return. Amateur explorers who claim, in old forum posts and grainy home videos, to have found strange carved openings in remote sections of cliff face, only to vanish from the internet entirely before ever posting proof. You will find dozens of these stories if you go looking, and almost none of them can be verified. Most were probably always exaggerations, misremembered hikes, or outright fabrications posted for attention. But every single one adds another thread to the tapestry, another reason for people to keep whispering that somewhere out there, someone found something they were never meant to find. There is also the question of restricted airspace. For years, a section of the canyon near the area described in the old article has been part of a no-fly zone, officially explained as a measure to protect condor habitat and reduce noise pollution over tribal land. Reasonable, boring even. And yet, to a mind already primed by decades of legend, a no-fly zone over the exact stretch of canyon, where a hidden underground city was once rumored to be, will always look a little too convenient. Let's take a breath here and be honest with each other for a moment, because that is what a good story deserves. The evidence, when you weigh it plainly, points toward the 1909 newspaper article being fiction. Sensational, uncredited, unphotographed, never followed up on, and flatly denied by the very institution it claimed to involve. If you are looking for a hidden Egyptian Tibetan megacity physically carved into the Grand Canyon, complete with mummies and copper tools, the honest answer is that no credible archaeological evidence for that has ever been found, and probably never will be. But that is not actually where the real mystery lies. The real mystery is not a buried city built by a lost Asian civilization. The real mystery is the Hopi story itself, the one that existed long before any newspaper ever touched it. A story about a doorway into this world, sitting at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. A story about beings who once lived beneath the earth and offered shelter to humanity in its darkest hours. A story so specific, so consistent, carried across so many generations by a people who never needed a sensational headline to keep it alive, that it deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not because a newspaper dressed it up in Egyptian imagery, but because it is one of the oldest continuously told stories on the entire continent, about the very ground you would be standing on if you hiked to the bottom of that canyon today. And that is the thing about legends like this one. They do not need to be literally, factually true in every detail to be true in a deeper sense. The Hopi did not need Egyptian mummies to make their story matter. Their story mattered because it explained who they were, where they came from, and what they owed to the earth beneath their feet. It told them how to survive catastrophe with dignity and discipline. It told them that the world does not end simply because it changes, that there is always a way forward, even if that way is down into the dark, before it is finally up into the light again. Maybe that is the real treasure buried beneath the Grand Canyon. Not gold, not mummies, not a forgotten empire, but a lesson carried carefully across 1,000 years about humility, patience, and the quiet, stubborn hope that even in the darkest tunnel, there is still a way out if you are willing to trust the ones who have walked it before you. Now let's slow down for a moment, because there is more to this story than the newspaper article and the myth that may or may not have inspired it. To really understand why this legend has such a grip on people, you have to understand the canyon itself a little better, and you have to understand who this man Kincaid was supposed to be, and why so many people, even now over 100 years later, still cannot quite let the story go. Picture Kincaid the way the old article described him. Not a scientist, not a professor with soft hands and a desk job, a river man, someone who had spent 3 decades of his life on the Colorado, back when running that river was not a tourist activity with life jackets and trained guides, but something closer to a death wish. In the early 1900s, the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon was one of the most dangerous stretches of white water on the entire continent. Boats capsized. Men drowned, entire expeditions vanished without a trace, their wooden boats found smashed against boulders miles downstream, no bodies ever recovered. To spend 30 years running that river alone, the way the article claimed Kincaid had, was already almost unbelievable on its own. It meant he had survived rapids that killed far younger, far better equipped men. It meant he knew the canyon walls the way most people know the streets of their own hometown, every bend, every eddy, every place where the current would try to kill you if you made one wrong move. A man like that, the story goes, would have spent thousands of hours simply staring at rock, watching the walls slide past him, day after day, year after year, the way a sailor watches the horizon. And it would have been exactly a man like that, and only a man like that, who might notice something the rest of the world never would. A patch of stone slightly the wrong color, a shadow that did not shift the way shadows should. A ledge high above the water that looked just a little too regular, a little too deliberate to be an accident of erosion. Whether or not Kincaid ever actually existed as described, whether the name was real or invented for the sake of the story, this detail is worth sitting with, because it tells you something about why the legend feels believable even now. It is not a story about a random tourist stumbling onto an ancient secret by dumb luck. It is a story about the one kind of person who actually could have found something like that. Someone who had spent a lifetime staring at the same walls, day after day, until the walls themselves started to whisper back. And here is something else worth knowing, something that skeptics rarely mention when they dismiss this story outright. The idea of hidden chambers and concealed passages within the Grand Canyon is not, on its own, some wild fantasy invented purely for a newspaper headline. Long before Kincaid, long before any Smithsonian expedition real or imagined, the ancestral Puebloan people, sometimes still called by the older term Anasazi, a word that actually comes from a Navajo phrase and is considered by many Puebloan descendants, including the Hopi, to be somewhat disrespectful, but which still appears throughout the archaeological record, genuinely did build structures deep within the canyon that archaeologists are still finding today. Granaries tucked into impossible ledges, accessible only by narrow hand and foot holds carved directly into sheer rock, built specifically so that stored food would be safe from flooding, from animals, and from raiders. Cliff dwellings pressed into alcoves so remote that hikers can walk within 100 feet of them without ever noticing they are there, camouflaged by the same red and tan tones as the surrounding stone. Split twig figurines, tiny woven animal shapes left behind by hunters 4,000 years ago, discovered sealed inside caves so deep and dark that whoever left them there would have needed fire just to see their own hands. These are not legends. These are documented, catalogued, verified archaeological facts. People really did build hidden, protected spaces deep inside this canyon, deliberately placed where no flood, no enemy, and no casual traveler would ever find them by accident. So when the Hopi speak of a hidden underworld sanctuary, and when an old newspaper article speaks of a hidden underground city, they are not inventing the idea of concealment out of nothing. They are drawing on a landscape that genuinely rewards concealment, a canyon that has proven, over and over, across thousands of years of continuous human habitation, that it is entirely capable of swallowing a structure whole and keeping it hidden for millennia. The only real question, the one nobody can answer for certain, is just how far that concealment goes, and just how large the things being concealed might be. There is another piece of this puzzle that deserves your attention, because it connects the Grand Canyon story to something far larger than one canyon, and far older than one newspaper article. Nearly every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, by mountains, by thousands of miles and thousands of years with no possible contact between them, tells some version of the same two stories. A story about a great flood or a great fire that nearly destroyed humanity. And a story about a hidden refuge, often underground, where a chosen few survived long enough to begin the world again. You hear it in the Hopi emergence story. You hear it in flood myths from Mesopotamia, from ancient Greece, from cultures across Asia, from indigenous nations scattered across two entire continents that had no contact with the old world at all. Something about that pattern, a disaster, a hidden shelter, a small group who survives and starts again, appears so consistently across human storytelling that some researchers have spent entire careers trying to explain why. Maybe it reflects a real ancient catastrophe, some shared trauma so severe that echoes of it survived in oral tradition across the entire globe. Maybe it simply reflects something universal about the human imagination, a shared fear of disaster paired with a shared hope that somewhere, somehow, there is always a way to survive it. Either way, the Hopi story of the Ant people and their underground refuge does not stand alone. It stands as one voice inside an enormous ancient chorus, all of them singing some version of the same haunting tune. The world can end, and if it does, there may still be a door beneath your feet. Let's return to the canyon itself, and to the decades that followed that strange 1909 headline, because the story did not simply fade away and get forgotten. It kept resurfacing, again and again, in odd little pockets of history, almost as if it refused to be buried. In the years after the article ran, a handful of self-styled treasure hunters and amateur explorers reportedly made their way into the canyon looking for the entrance the article had described, following whatever landmarks they could piece together from its vague description. Most came back with nothing but sunburn, exhaustion, and stories of their own, embellished a little more with each retelling at whatever saloon or campfire they told them at next. A few, according to local legend around the towns near the canyon's edge, never came back at all, though as we already discussed, that unfortunately was not an unusual outcome in a landscape this unforgiving, with or without a hidden city involved. Decades later, as commercial rafting and canyon tourism exploded in popularity through the middle of the 20th century, and thousands of ordinary people began running the same stretches of river that Kincaid supposedly knew so intimately, you might expect that any hidden entrance, if it existed, would have been stumbled upon by now, photographed on somebody's disposable camera, posted somewhere, verified or debunked once and for all. And in a strange way, that expectation is part of what makes skeptics so confident the whole story was fabricated from the start. Millions of visitors, thousands of river trips, helicopter tour passing over nearly every accessible stretch of canyon wall, satellite imagery detailed enough to spot a parked car from orbit. And still, in over a century, not one verified photograph, not one piece of physical evidence, not one official confirmation from any archaeologist, geologist, or park ranger has ever surfaced to support the idea of a vast man-made cavern system filled with ancient relics. And yet believers will tell you that argument cuts both ways. The Grand Canyon is not a small place that can be casually surveyed from a rafting trip or a helicopter window. It is nearly the size of the state of Rhode Island. It contains side canyons within side canyons, folded and hidden inside one another like the pages of a book nobody has ever fully opened. Even now, professional cave surveyors, using modern equipment, continue to discover previously unknown caves within park boundaries on a semi-regular basis, some of them significant enough to warrant new scientific papers. The National Park Service itself, cautious and famously tight-lipped about exact cave locations to protect them from vandalism, treasure hunters, and disease-sensitive bat colonies, does not publish a complete public map of every known opening in that landscape. Which means that even today, the honest, unglamorous truth is that nobody, not the Park Service, not any university, not any government agency, can claim with total certainty to know everything that exists beneath the surface of that canyon. The absence of confirmed evidence is not automatically the same thing as proof that nothing is there. It may simply mean that nobody has looked in the right place yet. Or it may mean that whatever is, there was never meant to be looked at by outsiders in the first place. That last possibility brings us to a part of this story that often gets overlooked entirely, buried under all the talk of hidden mummies and lost civilizations. The Hopi people themselves have never treated this as an open invitation for outsiders to go digging through their sacred land looking for buried treasure. Quite the opposite. Traditional Hopi teaching holds that certain places, certain stories, and certain forms of knowledge are simply not meant to be shared casually, let alone exploited for profit or fame. The Sipapu itself, the sacred opening near the Little Colorado, is treated with such reverence that even devout Hopi visitors approach it only after careful ceremonial preparation, and it is explicitly not treated as a tourist attraction or an archaeological dig site. When outside treasure hunters and self-styled adventurers have shown up over the decades hunting for lost cities and buried gold, many Hopi elders have responded not with excitement that their traditions were finally being taken seriously, but with quiet frustration, watching sacred stories about spiritual origin and moral responsibility get twisted into pulp adventure fiction, stripped of their meaning, repackaged as a treasure map. That distinction matters, and it is worth pausing on. The 1909 newspaper story treats the underground world as a place to be conquered, catalogued, and looted, an ancient city waiting to be discovered by clever outsiders and hauled off to a museum. The Hopi story treats the underworld as something almost entirely opposite, a place of humility, obligation, and gratitude, a refuge you are given, not a treasure you are entitled to seize. In the Hopi telling, the ant people did not save humanity so that future generations could dig up their tunnels for profit. They saved humanity so that humanity would remember how to live with respect for the earth, for each other, and for the unseen world beneath their feet. Losing sight of that difference is, in a way, exactly the kind of forgetting that got the earlier worlds destroyed in the first place, according to the very tradition being borrowed from. It is also worth knowing that the Hopi are far from alone among indigenous nations of the American Southwest in telling stories of an underworld connected to disaster and survival. Neighboring tribes, including the Zuni, the Navajo, and various Pueblo nations along the Rio Grande, each carry their own versions of emergent stories, multiple prior worlds, ascent through a sacred opening, and encounters with beings who exist beneath the visible surface of the earth. The details differ from nation to nation, sometimes significantly, and it would be a mistake to flatten them all into one single generic legend, because each nation's story belongs specifically to that nation's history, language, and spiritual life. But the broad pattern, worlds beneath worlds, an opening between them and beings who exist in that hidden space, echoes across an enormous stretch of the American Southwest, suggesting either a very old shared cultural root or a very old shared experience, or perhaps simply a shared relationship with a landscape so dramatic, so layered, and so full of literal holes in the ground, that it would be strange if it had not inspired stories about worlds beneath worlds. Which brings us, finally, back to the mystery at the heart of all of this, the question that no newspaper article, no Smithsonian denial, and no century of amateur expeditions has ever managed to fully settle. What if the 1909 story was invented, cobbled together by a bored reporter looking for a headline that would sell papers on a slow news day, and yet the reason it felt so believable, the reason it spread so far and lasted so long, is that it was quietly borrowing the outline of something real. Not an Egyptian megacity with mummies and copper tools, but the shape of an older, deeper truth. A canyon riddled with real hidden chambers. A people who really did build concealed shelters into its walls for thousands of years. And a sacred tradition, carried far longer than the newspaper industry itself has existed, describing an underworld refuge entered through a hidden opening, exactly where the article claimed to place its fictional one. Maybe the lie and the truth got tangled together so thoroughly, so long ago, that by now it is genuinely impossible to fully separate them. Maybe that tangle is exactly why this story refuses to die, generation after generation, retold on porches and campfires, and now on screens like the one you are watching right now. Because somewhere underneath all the sensationalism, underneath the copper tools and the mummies and the vanished professor, whose name appears nowhere else in any historical record, there is a real canyon, genuinely riddled with hidden spaces, genuinely home to a people whose most sacred story tells them exactly where the door to the underworld can be found. There is one more layer to this story, and it might be the strangest one of all, because it does not come from a dusty newspaper archive. It comes from stone, carved by hand, and it is still sitting out in the open desert today, for anyone willing to make the drive to see it. Near the village of Old Oribi, considered by many to be the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the entire United States, there is a large boulder that has come to be known, in the modern era, as Prophecy Rock. Carved into its surface are lines and figures that some Hopi elders have interpreted, in conversations with outsiders over the past century, as a kind of long-range prophecy about the future of the world, and specifically about a choice that humanity would eventually face. Two paths are shown branching off from the same starting point. One path represents a way of living guided by respect, balance, and connection to the earth and to spiritual tradition. The other represents a path of technology pursued without wisdom, a way of living that grows faster and faster, more and more disconnected from the earth, until it eventually breaks apart entirely. It is important to be careful here, because prophecy rock has been interpreted and reinterpreted many times by many different people, not all of them Hopi, and not all of them accurately representing what any given elder actually said. Outsiders have sometimes taken vague, general teachings and packaged them into specific doomsday predictions that were never actually part of the original interpretation, and that kind of exaggeration deserves the same skepticism as the Kincaid newspaper story itself. But underneath the exaggerations, there is a real, documented tradition among some Hopi elders of speaking about what they call the Great Purification, a period of upheaval and transformation that would test humanity's ability to return to a path of balance, much like the destructions that are said to have ended each of the earlier worlds before this one. And here is the detail that keeps drawing people back to the underground story again and again. In some versions of this prophetic tradition, it is said that when the Great Purification comes, those who have kept faith with the old ways, who have remained humble and connected to the earth, will once again be shown the way to safety, the same way their ancestors once were, through hidden places prepared long ago, some of them below the surface of the ground. Whether that below-ground refuge is meant literally, as an actual physical location, or spiritually, as a metaphor for humility and inner steadiness in a chaotic world, depends entirely on who you ask, and elders themselves have given different answers to that question over the years, some cautious about literal interpretations, some more open to them. But the recurring image, danger above, safety below, a hidden shelter reserved for those who remember how to live rightly, threads all the way from the oldest emergence stories, through the ant people legend, through the 1909 newspaper story, and all the way to a boulder still sitting in the Arizona desert today, waiting for anyone curious enough to go looking for it. It is worth pausing here to talk about the explorers who kept the Kincaid legend alive long after the original newspaper folded into obscurity, because their stories are almost as strange as the one they were chasing. In the decades that followed, a loose, scattered community of self-taught historians and amateur archaeologists kept returning to the 1909 article, poring over its geography, trying to reconcile phrases like 45 miles up the river from a spot called Ryan with real modern topographic surveys of the canyon. Some of them spent years of their lives on this. They cross-referenced old mining claims. They studied historic riverboat logs. They interviewed elderly residents of small towns near the canyon rim who remembered, or claimed to remember, half-forgotten rumors passed down from their own grandparents about strange lights seen deep in the canyon at night, or about old-timers who once swore they had seen a carved opening in the rock that was never there again the next time anyone looked for it. One persistent thread of the legend involves a series of unmarked survey markers that some researchers claim to have located on canyon maps from the early 20th century, positioned in a pattern that does not obviously correspond to any known mining claim, any known trail, or any known official government project. Skeptics point out that unexplained markers on century-old maps are common for all kinds of mundane reasons: abandoned projects, surveying errors, private claims that were simply never followed up on, and that reading a hidden conspiracy into a few stray dots on an old map says more about human pattern recognition than it does about buried cities. But believers hold onto details like this the way a prospector holds onto a promising vein of ore, convinced that somewhere in the mess of half-documented history, a real clue is still waiting to be found. Then there are the stranger stories, the ones that drift further from anything resembling documented history and closer to pure campfire tale, the kind that get past hiker to hiker, guide to tourist, generation to generation, gathering detail and losing accuracy with every retelling. Stories of backcountry rangers who supposedly stumbled onto sealed openings in remote sections of the canyon decades ago, only to be quietly told by their superiors to log the location, report it up the chain, and never speak of it publicly again. Stories of old prospectors who vanished into side canyons looking for silver and gold, and came out again days later, gaunt, sunburned, and utterly unwilling to discuss what they had seen, refusing ever again to guide anyone into that same stretch of canyon for any amount of money. None of these stories hold up to serious scrutiny. None of them have named witnesses, verifiable dates, or documentation of any kind. They exist the way ghost stories exist, sincerely believed by some, dismissed by others, impossible to prove and equally impossible to fully disprove, precisely because the landscape they are set in is so enormous, so remote, and so poorly documented in its farthest corners that almost anything could plausibly have happened out there without anyone else ever finding out. And that, in the end, might be the real engine driving this legend forward, more than any single piece of evidence for or against it. The Grand Canyon is one of the most photographed, most visited, most studied natural landmarks on the entire planet, and yet it remains, in a very real and measurable sense, one of the least explored. Millions of tourists stand at the rim every single year, snapping photographs from the same handful of overlooks, walking the same handful of maintained trails, riding the same mule paths that have carried visitors down to the river for well over a century. But away from those trails, away from the overlooks, the canyon is still wild in a way that very few places left on Earth still are. Steep, crumbling, waterless for miles at a stretch, home to venomous snakes and scorpions and sudden flash floods that can turn a dry wash into a wall of water in minutes with no warning at all. It is a landscape that actively resists being fully known, even by the people whose job it is to study it. And in a landscape like that, it does not take much imagination to believe that something, somewhere, might still be waiting quietly in the dark, exactly where the old stories always said it would be. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between a hoax and a memory, probably. A newspaper story almost certainly invented to sell copies to a public hungry for adventure and mystery, in an era before radio, before television, before the internet, when a good tall tale in the morning paper was one of the most exciting things a person could read over breakfast. And underneath that invented story, a real, sacred, deeply serious tradition, carried by a real people, describing a real place, a real doorway, and a real memory of catastrophe survived through humility, patience, and shelter found underground. Perhaps that is exactly why this story continues to circulate more than a century after it first appeared. It sits at the exact crossroads where careless fiction and sacred truth happen to overlap, and once a story finds that crossroads, it almost never lets go. Every generation that hears it adds its own layer, its own doubt, its own hope that maybe this time, someone will finally find the door. Let's take one more walk through this story, this time looking at it from a slightly different angle, because there is a question we have not fully answered yet, and it might be the most important one of all. Why would a canyon this well known, this thoroughly mapped by modern technology, still be able to hide something as large as an underground city, if one really existed? It is a fair question, and it deserves a fair answer, grounded not in wishful thinking, but in the actual, physical reality of the place. The Grand Canyon is not a simple bowl carved into flat ground. It is a labyrinth. The main canyon itself is only the largest and most visible part of a system that includes hundreds of side canyons, branching off the main gorge like veins branching off an artery, many of them narrow, twisting and shadowed for almost the entire day, cut so deep and so tightly that direct sunlight barely reaches the canyon floor even at midday. Some of these side canyons have never been formally surveyed at all. Others were surveyed decades ago, using equipment and methods that look almost laughably primitive by today's standards: a rough compass bearing, a hand-sketched map, an estimate of distance based on how many hours a mule could walk before nightfall. Modern satellite and drone mapping has filled in a great deal of that old uncertainty, but even now, with all our advanced technology, mapping the surface of a canyon is not the same thing as mapping what lies beneath it. Radar and satellite imaging can tell you an enormous amount about the shape of exposed rock. They cannot easily see through hundreds of feet of solid stone to detect a hollow chamber sealed off from the outside world, especially not in terrain this rugged, where even modern ground-penetrating equipment struggles to get accurate readings across such extreme, uneven elevation changes. Layer on top of that the sheer geological complexity of the place. The rock layers exposed in the canyon walls span an almost unbelievable range of ages and types, from the youngest limestone near the rim, laid down when shallow seas covered this part of the continent hundreds of millions of years ago, all the way down to the oldest, darkest rock at the very bottom of the inner gorge, rock that formed nearly 2 billion years ago, long before there was any complex life on Earth at all. Different rock types erode differently, crack differently, and form cave systems differently. Limestone in particular is famous around the world for producing extensive natural cave networks, because it slowly dissolves when acidic water moves through it over long periods of time, carving out chambers, tunnels, and passages that can stretch for miles underground, completely invisible from the surface until someone happens to find the one small opening that leads inside. The Grand Canyon contains significant limestone layers, and cavers who have studied the region seriously, setting aside all the mythology for a moment, confirm that the geological conditions for genuinely large, genuinely unexplored cave systems absolutely do exist here. This is not fringe speculation. It is simply how the rock itself works. So when someone insists that a large hidden cavern system inside the Grand Canyon is geologically impossible, they are overstating the case. What is far more accurate to say is that a specific claim, an enormous man-made city complete with carved hallways, storage rooms, and Egyptian-style statuary, sitting exactly where a 1909 newspaper article said it would, with no supporting evidence ever surfacing in over a century, is almost certainly false as described. But the broader idea that this canyon could contain large, unexplored natural cave systems, systems that ancient peoples might have found, adapted, and used as shelter long before anyone wrote a single word about them, is not only possible, it is close to a documented fact. Archaeologists have already confirmed ancient human use of cave sites within the canyon for storage, for shelter, and quite likely for ceremonial purposes as well. The line between an ordinary limestone cave used by ancestral Puebloan farmers to store their harvest, and a legendary underworld sanctuary described across countless generations of Hopi oral tradition, may not be as wide a gap as it first appears. Sometimes a sacred story and a practical shelter are not two different things at all. Sometimes they are the very same place, remembered two different ways by two very different kinds of people. There is also something worth saying about why this particular legend has resonated so strongly with people living in the modern world, far beyond the borders of the Hopi nation, far beyond the readers who first opened that Phoenix newspaper back in 1909. We live, right now, in an era that talks constantly about collapse. About climate disruption, about resource scarcity, about the fragile, complicated systems that keep modern life running smoothly, and about what might happen if those systems ever failed all at once. It is not an accident that stories about ancient underground refuges, hidden shelters prepared long in advance, keep resurfacing in the public imagination during exactly this kind of era. Something about the idea speaks directly to a very old, very human fear, and a very old, very human hope, both at the same time. The fear that the world as we know it could end, suddenly, without warning, the way it apparently has ended before more than once, according to traditions carried by peoples all over the globe. And the hope that somewhere, somehow, preparation made long ago by people wiser than us might still be waiting, quietly, patiently, to offer a way through. The Hopi have carried that exact hope, wrapped inside a warning, for longer than almost any other continuously told story on this continent. Their tradition does not simply promise safety. It ties that safety directly to behavior, to humility, to respect for the earth and for each other. In that sense, the story of the ant people and their hidden shelter is not really a treasure map at all, whatever a 1909 newspaper writer might have wanted his readers to believe. It is closer to an instruction manual, disguised as a myth, quietly insisting for over 1,000 years that survival was never really about finding the right tunnel. It was always about becoming the kind of person, and building the kind of community, worth leading down into that tunnel in the first place. And maybe that is exactly why, even now, so many people who hear this story for the very first time feel something shift inside them, something they cannot quite name. It is not simply the thrill of a hidden treasure, or the chill of an unsolved mystery, though both of those things are certainly part of it. It is something a little deeper than that, a quiet, uneasy recognition that the story is not really about ancient Egyptians, or lost civilizations, or forgotten newspaper headlines at all. It is about us, about whether we are the kind of people who deserve to find the door, should it ever open, about whether we have remembered or forgotten the lessons that were supposedly worth saving humanity for in the first place. Still, if you ever find yourself standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, watching the shadows shift across those ancient red walls as the sun goes down, you might feel it too. That strange, prickling sense that you are standing at the edge of something far bigger than scenery, that somewhere below you in the folds and cracks of stone older than almost anything on Earth, there really might be a door, sealed, waiting, forgotten by everyone except the people who never stopped believing it was there. And if you ever do find it, if you ever stand in front of an opening in that rock that should not be there, remember what the old stories say. Go slowly, go humbly, and whatever you do, listen closely, because the ones who are said to live down there have been waiting a very, very long time for someone to finally come home. The canyon keeps its secrets well. It always has. Rivers carve stone, wind carves rivers, and time carves everything else, slowly, patiently, without ever explaining itself to the people standing at the rim, staring down into the dark, wondering what they are really looking at. Think about everything this one legend has managed to pull together, across more than 1,000 years, without ever being written down in a single official book, without ever needing a museum exhibit or a peer-reviewed paper to keep it alive. A creation story that explains where an entire nation believes it came from. A sacred site that people still walk for days across brutal desert to visit, exactly as their ancestors did long before any road existed to make the journey easier. A newspaper hoax that borrowed just enough of that sacred story to feel true, and then took on a life of its own, outliving the very publication that printed it. A A century of amateur explorers, treasure hunters, cavers, and curious travelers, all chasing the same rumor, most finding nothing, a few finding just enough strangeness in the landscape to keep the story breathing for one more generation. A prophecy carved into stone, still standing out in the open desert, still being debated and reinterpreted by people trying to understand what their elders truly meant. And underneath all of it, a canyon so large, so folded, so genuinely unexplored in its farthest corners, that no one not scientist, not skeptic, not believer, can honestly claim to know everything it contains. That is a remarkable thing for a single legend to accomplish. Most stories fade after a generation or two, forgotten the moment the people who first told them pass away. This one has done the opposite. It has grown, it has adapted, it has absorbed new evidence, new skepticism, new generations of retelling, and somehow come out the other side even more compelling than when it started, not despite the uncertainty surrounding it, but because of it. A fully solved mystery gets filed away and forgotten. An unsolved one gets passed down, hand to hand, voice to voice, exactly the way the Hopi have passed down their own oldest stories, since long before anyone thought to write anything down at all. So maybe the real question was never simply whether the underground city is real. Maybe the real question is why we, all of us, keep needing stories like this one in the first place. Why the idea of a hidden shelter beneath our feet, prepared long ago by people wiser than us, waiting quietly for the moment we finally need it, speaks to something so deep and so old inside the human mind that it appears, in one form or another, in nearly every culture that has ever existed on this planet. Maybe that need says less about the Grand Canyon and more about us, standing here at the edge of an uncertain world, still hopping, the way people have always hoped, that somewhere below the surface of things, some kind of shelter is still waiting. Maybe someday, someone will finally find the doorway the old stories speak of, and prove, once and for all, exactly what is waiting beneath the Grand Canyon. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that keeps this story alive more than any other, maybe it was never meant to be found by us at all. Maybe some doors are only ever meant to be opened once, by the people who were led through them at the beginning of the world, and the rest of us are only ever meant to stand at the rim, looking down, and wonder.